Chapter 32. August 1945. The heavy silence of August 1945 was broken not by a gunshot, but by the crackle of the wireless. In the drawing room at Ear House, the radio hummed with static before the BBC announcer's voice, clipped and surreal, broadcast news of a weapon that had turned the air to fire over Hiroshima. Josephine sat by the window, her hands resting on the sudden, heavy stillness of her abdomen. The world was changing a broken bar. The old war of knives, wire, and parachutes was being incinerated by the birth of the atomic age. "It's over," Bill whispered, standing by the radio. "The whole bloody world is over." 88,888,888. Throughout the sweltering August heat, Josephine maintained her grueling ritual. Every morning, she ignored the midwife's warnings and walked the mile-long stretch of gravel and heather to the village, her breath hitching as she sought the morning papers. She was looking for a Signa broken bar, any Signa broken bar of David Sterling. And, on the morning that the world heard of Nagasaki, and rain began to fall softly on the gardens of Ear House, breaking the heat of the previous days, labor began. It was not the ordeal Josephine had feared. Perhaps her body, hardened by the miles she had walked and the terrors she had survived, simply refused to struggle. It was swift, intense, and oddly quiet. Within hours, before the sun had even reached mid-morning, Arthur Archibald Sterling was born. When the midwife placed him in her arms, Ethan of the So vanished. The instant she saw the boy, delicate but perfect, raw, primal love flooded her. He was the only truth she had left. And her life pivoted to one around which Archie was the center. 88,888,888. Bill entered the room as the last light of the day touched the heather in the west. He looked at the infant, then at Josephine. She had shifted her gown, the fabric falling away as she guided the child to her breast. "He looks like him, Josephine," Bill said, his voice a mere breath. He didn't say David's name, and she didn't offer it. She had never admitted anything, but the sterling features, forget-me-not blue and piercing, were a silent, undeniable testimony in the evening light. Bill's eyes instinctively darted away as Archie's head bobbed away, and instead he looked towards the window, at the grey highland mist, a sudden, sharp awkwardness tightening his throat. The wedding was no longer a theoretical act of chivalry, it was an impending reality. He knew Josephine, knew the fire in her, the absolute, rugged honesty of her nature. She wouldn't expect a marriage of convenience or a chaste arrangement of convenience. She would expect a full marriage, a physical union to match the legal one. His mind betrayed him, the silence of the room amplifying the heat in his blood. He thought of her hands, the strength in them, imagining them on his cock. He thought of the curve of her body and his own mouth on her breasts where the child had recommenced his feed, remembered the scars her body endured, from her section, from the beating his brother had given her under the orders of the Colditz commandant when David believed she was a collaborator with the Germans. The weight of his desire felt like a betrayal of the sanctuary he was trying to build, yet it was the very thing that made the proposal real. "The papers. I'm done with them, Bill," she said, her voice dry, but of titanium. "No more walking to the crossroads. I want the name. I want the shield of this house around him." She looked at him, her gaze demanding he meet her eyes. "I want to marry you. Tomorrow morning. No more delays." Bill cleared his throat, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, his jaw set. The atomic age had begun, and the old legends were fading into ghosts, but here in the quiet of Kiev, a new, heavy truth was taking root. "I'll bring the priest," Bill promised. "You'll be a sterling before the week is over." 88,888,888. The nursery was thick with the scent of lavender and the rhythmic, soft breathing of the sleeping infant in the early hours of that morning. Bill had waited, pacing the library, the closeness of the previous night and the weight of the impending vows pulling at his restraint. When he finally entered Josephine's room, the door clicking shut behind him, the air between them felt heavy, charged with a tension that hadn't existed when she was merely a special case to be sheltered. Bill moved toward her with a quiet, deliberate gravity. Unlike David's erratic, predatory energy, which always felt like a storm breaking, Bill was a grounded force. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her into his arms. His touch was firm, possessive but fundamentally protective, and Josephine surrendered to him unconditionally. When he began to kiss her, it wasn't the desperate, biting hunger of the bunker. His mouth was warm, seeking her with a slow, thorough intensity that spoke of a man claiming a future rather than a man exorcising a demon. He eased her back against the pillows, his hands sliding beneath her robe. His palms were broad and firm, moving over her skin with a reverence that made her feel, for the first time in years, like something precious rather than something used. As he moved his mouth to her breast, the sensation was a jarring departure from the past. Where David had been all sharp edges and demands, Bill was a steady, rising tide. His intimacy felt like a sanctuary, his hands a physical shield against the world outside. But as his fingers moved lower, tracing the line of her hip toward the heat of her center, Josephine gasped, her hand suddenly catching his wrist. "Please," she whispered, her eyes wide and shimmering with a sudden, sharp clarity. "Please, Bill. Let us be married first." She sat up, pulling her robe tight, her breath short. "I am a Roman Catholic, Bill. From when I married Michael. I cannot have this be another performance in the shadow. I want to be right before God. I want this to be real." Bill looked at her, the frustration in his blood warring with the deep, abiding respect he held for her ironclad will. He nodded slowly, his thumb grazing her cheek. "As you wish, Ithnia broken bar Josephine," he corrected himself. "The chapel is ready. I will wire McNeil. 88,888,888. There was no white silk, no fanfare. Josephine, dressed in her smartest uniform clothes, crisp, tailored, and comfortable, looked every bit the officer who had survived the shadows of the Rye and walked into the private stone chapel of Ear House. The ceremony was brief, held in the flickering light of ancient candles. Bill stood beside her, his hand never leaving the small of her back. He was her protector, her shield, and as they spoke the vows, a profound sense of peace settled over her. They would have a happy life. It would be a life built on stability, respect, and the quiet strength of the Highlands. The "I do" had barely echoed against the stone when the heavy oak doors of the chapel were flung open with a violent crash. David Sterling stood in the threshold, his clothes tattered, his eyes wild with the madness of a man who had run across a continent to reclaim a ghost. He looked haggard, a phantom of the man who had founded the SAS. "Stop it!" David roared, his voice cracking. "Bill, you cannot do this. She's mine." He took a frantic step forward, but a massive, soot-stained hand caught him by the shoulder, spinning him around with the force of a landslide. Paddy Mayne surged into the chapel behind him. Paddy looked like he had chased David from the very gates of hell. His face was a mask of feral rage, his knuckles bruised, his breath coming in ragged growls. "You're too late, David," Paddy retorted, shoving him back against the stone wall with a force that rattled the icons. "She's a Sterling now, a real one. And if you take one more step toward my sister, I'll finish what the Germans ... and what she," he nodded towards Josephine, "couldn't." Josephine stood at the altar, her hand locked firmly in Bill's. She didn't flinch. She looked at David, the man who had broken her, and then at Bill, her shield. The man she had been charged to liberate had finally run home. But, for Josephine's hand, David Sterling was too late. 88,888,888. The stone chapel of Ear House became a pressure cooker of 3 years' worth of spilled blood and unspoken betrayals. David leaned against the cold masonry, his chest heaving, his eyes darting between Bill's protective stance and the woman who looked at him with a gaze as cold as a bayonet. Paddy didn't let go of David's collar. He held him with a lethal, vibrating tension, his blue eyes fixed on the altar. "It's over, David," Paddy growled. "She's chosen. And for once in your life, you're going to accept a no." "I didn't come to steal her, Bill," David shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I came to tell the truth. I found a broken bar. I ended it." "I ended it," Josephine corrected him. David scowled at her with the old familiar competitiveness returning for a moment. "She's dead, Bill. The debt is paid." "The debt to the service, perhaps," Bill replied, his voice a low, aristocratic thunder that commanded the room, the older brother towing his younger, wayward sibling into line. "But the debt to the woman standing beside me? You haven't even begun to pay that. You're a ghost, David. And ghosts have no place in a nursery." Josephine stood perfectly still. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like a commander presiding over a court-martial. Her smart uniform was crisp and she felt Bill's hand on her waist, firmly grounding her with its soft pressure, feeling like the only thing keeping the world from spinning off its axis. "I am not your prize, David," she said, her voice cutting through the men's posturing. "I am a wife. I am a mother. And I am a mania. Broken bar now is sterling. Please see broken bar, just a broken bar, leave a broken bar." 8,888,888. Just then, however, the priest stepped forward. Father Douglas McNeil held the parish register in trembling hands, his brow furrowed as he looked from the heated confrontation back to his records. "Peace, gentlemen," Father McNeil interjected, his voice thin but insistent. "There is a grave complication." The room went silent. Paddy tightened his fists, and not just from the interruption, rather because it was from the papist representative before them. He had not been present for the ceremony, but had given Bill Sterling his wholehearted permission as Josephine's closest relative, to marry her. All listened to McNeil now as he stood before them. "I have been reviewing the declarations for the banns," the priest continued, looking at Josephine with a mixture of pity and professional sternness. "You stated you were a widow, Josephine. Married to one Michael O'Neill in a Catholic ceremony in Ireland." "I was," she whispered, her heart skipping a beat. "In 1939. The Church requires a record of death or a certificate of nullity for a sacramental union to proceed," the priest said, tapping the empty lines in the register. "My inquiries to the Diocese of Armagh have returned nothing. There is no record of a Michael O'Neill's death in their books, nor a record of the marriage being dissolved. Without proof that your first husband is dead in the eyes of the Church." He closed the heavy book with a soft, final thud. "I cannot sign this register. I cannot complete the rite. By the laws of the Church, Josephine, you and William are not properly married yet. You are still, in the eyes of God, the wife of the Irishman." The silence that followed was absolute. David let out a deep, hysterical laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Bill's hand dropped from Josephine's waist as if he'd been burned, the sudden legal and spiritual void opening up between them. Paddy looked at his sister, his face pale. "Joey. Michael's dead. We saw the train. We saw the fire. The Church doesn't care what we saw, Paddy," she breathed, her world fracturing once again. "They care what is written." She looked at Bill, who stood there, her shield, her protector, suddenly rendered a stranger by a clerical technicality. Then she looked at David, whose eyes burned with a terrifying, renewed hope. 8,888,888. The heavy oak doors of the chapel swung shut behind Josephine, muffling the roar of the three men in her life. She clutched Archie to her chest, the infant's warmth a stark contrast to the glacial stone of the hallway. The violence behind her was inevitable. She heard the sickening thud of a fist meeting bone, followed by the crashing of a decorative candelabra. It was Paddy and David, a collision of two predators who had shared a desert but could never share a woman. Bill would be trying to play the peacekeeper, but his own heartbreak would likely turn his grip into a weapon. Josephine stopped in the gallery. If there is no record of the banns, she thought, her mind working with the cold precision of an intelligence officer, there might be no record of the marriage at all. Michael O'Neill had always been a ghost of a man. If the church had no paper on him, she wasn't a widow, she was, in their eyes, unmarried. She didn't have religion. The war had burned the ritual out of her. But she had a belief in a God who watched from the rafters of ruined churches. If she converted, if she started again, she could be free. She turned back, her heels clicking on the stone, and re-entered the chapel, ready for her say now, ready to fight for the man she wanted to marry, and to do it on his terms. 88,888,888. The scene was one that had been a long time coming. Paddy had David pinned against a carved pew, his hand around David's throat, while Bill struggled to pull Paddy back, his own face contorted with a silent, aristocratic fury. David wasn't fighting back, he was laughing, a hollow, mocking sound. Enough. Josephine's voice cracked like a whip. The men froze. She ignored the blood on David's lip and the wild light in Paddy's eyes. She marched straight to the priest, who was clutching a crucifix as if it were a shield. "Father," she said, her voice dropping to a subsonic hum. "If there is no record of Michael, then I am nobody's wife. I will not be used as a prize for their brawling. I am leaving. And I am taking my son." She turned to leave, her back straight, the very picture of the woman who had walked out of Saxony. 88,888,888. David was the first to break. He shook off a Paddy and Bill, stumbling after her into the highland rain that had begun to lash against the Gear estate. "Josephine!" he shouted. He caught up to her by the stone fountain. "I love you. I didn't come back for the service. I came back for you." "You ran," she hissed, the rain blurring her vision. "In Geneva, you chose the game. You chose the deception." Yeah, broken bar, thought you'd understand why," David pleaded, his hands reaching out but not daring to touch the child. It was a deception for her. Eve. She would never have accepted me if she thought I was hostile. We a broken bar had to give her something she desired above everything else. Josephine's eyes narrowed. We? Then her hypothesis had been vindicated after all. Dudley Rangel Clark. It was the only way to get her to show her hand, David admitted, the Phantom Major finally stripped bare. "Clark and we had to play the long game to ensure she could never haunt you again." Josephine looked at the manor house. She wanted to say she loved Bill. He made her feel safe. He was the shield she had craved in the darkness of the bunker. But marrying him for safety was a sin even she couldn't commit. It wasn't right to turn a good man into a hiding place. "You came to free me, twice," he whispered, the anger receding into a heavy, leaden weariness in Josephine's mind as he spoke. "And then you got the whole bloody lot of them out of Colditz. A lot of them made it because of you, too." He took a step back, his eyes glancing over the bundle of blankets which was wriggling. Josephine adjusted her grip of Archie and freed his little hand that he had shuffled under himself. "I don't know what to do now," David admitted, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. Behind them, Bill and Paddy emerged from the chapel, their tempers cooled by the now insistent train that had begun to throw itself down from the heavens. Bill looked at Josephine, his expression one of profound, quiet heartbreak. Do nothing at the moment, Bill said, stepping forward. Live at Ear House. We'll look after the boy. Oh, and the priest wants to know if you're serious. Souls for God and all that. Josephine shook her head, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks. She looked at Bill, her heart breaking for the man who had offered her everything. I can't marry you, Bill. It isn't fair to you. It is ... and always will be ... the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. But I cannot be your wife out of gratitude. You're not marrying him, are you? Bill glared at David, who stood there looking like he'd somehow come up smelling of roses despite the blood on his face. No, Josephine said. She looked at Archie, who had miraculously slept through the thunder. At least ... not today. I feel weary. I just want to go back. Paddy stepped forward, the elder brother's instinct taking over. He supported Josephine's arm, his touch uncharacteristically gentle. David, sensing a shift in the wind, stepped in and took Archie from her arms. Bill watched, his jaw tight with consternation, as the most unlikely procession in Scotland began to walk back toward the house. 88,888,888. And there might have been the end of the story, a stalemate in the Highlands, except for two things. Waiting on the hall table was a message for David. Major Sterling had been summoned back to North Africa. The world wasn't done with the Phantom Major yet, and he wouldn't go alone. And, as David left for London, and onwards, to Libya, in Josephine's room, tucked under her pillow, was the small red-orange sandstone, once part of Edinburgh Castle's volcanic substructure. She had last seen it cast on the table in the solitary cell in Colditz, there as evidence of her word, the man she loved denying it despite the evidence. On it, David had carved for her a heart. 88,888,888. The mist of the Highlands had been replaced by the soot and steam of the London railway station. 18 months of peace had done little to settle the spirits of the men who had lived by the knife. Paddy Mayne stood on the platform, his kit bag over his shoulder, looking like a caged lion finally spotting an open gate. The war in Japan is over, Paddy. David said, his voice echoing under the iron girders of the station. The Emperor surrendered a year and a half ago. There's nothing left to fight for in Burma. Paddy didn't even turn his head. His eyes were fixed on the tracks heading south. I'm going anyway. There's a mess out there, and I intend to be in the middle of it. The jungle doesn't care about treaties, David. Beside him, Josephine stood in a long trench coat, her hair tucked under a sand-colored beret. She adjusted the strap of her own bag, her eyes meeting David's with a familiar, stubborn fire. You're going with him? David's voice rose, a mix of disbelief and the old, possessive fear. He stepped forward, reaching for her arm. Josephine, stop. You have a son at Kiev. You have a life. I have a restless soul, David, she countered. And Paddy needs someone to watch his back who isn't afraid of the dark. I won't let you go, David growled, his jaw set. You want to stop me? Really? She stepped into his space, her chin tilted up. If I go, and if we get back, I'll marry you. Properly. No priests, no records of the dead. Just us. David froze. He had asked her every Sunday for 78 weeks. He had been a beggar at her door, a man trying to earn a glance. You will? I will. She didn't wait for his reply. She pulled him down by his lapels and kissed him, not a goodbye, but a claim. It was raw and desperate, turning sensual in an instant as his hands tangled in her hair. David's restraint snapped, his hands moved down her back, pulling her flush against him, his fingers digging into the heavy wool of her coat as he tasted the salt and heat of her. It was medium petting in a very public place. His hands bowled on her hips, her body arching into his right there on the platform, a scandalous reclamation of the intimacy they had forged in the mud of Saxony. "Oi!" Paddy's voice thundered, a sharp cough cutting through the steam. "Tell the commanding officer to put down my sister. There's a train to catch." They broke apart, breathless. Paddy looked at the morning paper tucked under a stranger's arm. "News says they finally stretched the neck of William Joyce this morning. Lord Haw Haw is a dead man at last." The mention of her brother's namesake brought a momentary shadow to Josephine's face, but it passed. She looked at David, who was still reeling from the promise and the touch. Paddy adjusted his bag, looking at David with a lingering, weary suspicion. "He's a peacock and a liar, Joey. I still don't know what you see in him." Josephine climbed the steps to the carriage, pausing to look back at the man standing on the platform. "Sometimes I don't know either, Robbie," she said softly. "We are too similar, both of us play dirty, both of us are never quite home. I think that's the problem. And I love him." And she thought of her comrades, of Galitzine and Barkworth, still working away feverishly off the books because the SAS were disbanded, in order to bring every monster behind the night and fog to justice, and of Druce, who had visited them in the summer, and brought a surprise of his own, a wife, who was expecting, and their emigration to Vancouver. The whistle blew, a mournful, screaming sound. As Sterling caught her eye and offered that familiar, arrogant smirk, the one that still made her blood boil and her heart race, Josephine knew the legend of the Sterlings was only just beginning. 88,888,888. Epilogue. The news reached Bill in the sterile, hushed corridors of the War Office in London. A road traffic accident in Enniskillen. A masonry truck, a dark Irish road, and the sudden, violent extinguishing of a man who had survived 1,000 more likely deaths. Paddy Mayne, the lion of the SAS, was gone, not by a sniper's bullet or a jungle fever, but by the mundane cruelty of a rain-slicked turn. Bill caught the midnight train to Scotland, the rhythm of the tracks a dull thud against his grieving heart. He knew that by the time he crossed the border, his brother would have already delivered the blow. David would have been the one to tell her, and the thought of that collision, the two of them alone with the news, pushed Bill to move faster. When Bill stepped into the library at Ear House, the silence was absolute. The fire had burned down to white ash. He stopped at the threshold, his breath uneven. Josephine was on the floor, her body racked with the kind of guttural, soul-deep sobbing that only comes when the foundation of one's world is ripped away. She wasn't just losing a brother, she was losing her North Star. Paddy had been her compass, the one man who understood the language of her scars without needing a translation. Without him, the map of her life was a blur of hostile territory. David was there, sunk to the floor beside her. His own devastation was etched into the hollows of his face. He didn't try to offer platitudes, he simply held her, his own shoulders shaking with the loss of the friend who had been his conscience and his greatest rival. Bill lingered in the doorway, a spectre in the house he had once offered as a sanctuary. He thought of the woman he had recently met in London, a charming, bright girl with a laugh that didn't carry the weight of a war. She was a different kind of life, a path that didn't lead through minefields. He looked at Josephine and David, huddled together in their shared grief, and realized with a piercing clarity that he had been right to step aside. They were two people perfectly, tragically right for each other. They embodied David's own motto, who dares wins, but the cost of their daring was a bond that no normal life could ever match. Josephine would be itching to go off again, Bill knew. She would crave the fire and the mission to drown out the silence Paddy had left behind. But without her compass, she would be lost in the woods. David was the storm, but Paddy had been the earth. Bill watched David pull her closer, the two of them anchored to each other in the wreckage. He had intended to leave, to return to his new life and the girl in London, but as he looked at the shattered remains of the most dangerous duo in the King's service, he changed his mind. He wouldn't take her on, not as a lover or a husband, but he would be the shield one last time. He decided to stay at Gia for a while. He would manage the estate, watch over Archie, and provide the steady, quiet floor they needed while they learned how to walk in a world without Paddy Mayne. Bill walked softly to the sideboard, poured 3 glasses of the heavy peat scotch Paddy had loved, and set them down near the grieving bear. He didn't say a word. He simply sat in the armchair by the cold hearth and began the long vigil. He would be there for both of them. Bill Sterling held in his hand a letter, for Josephine. She may change once she had read it, she may soften. It had been hard won and, on his part, hard work. It meant they could go on together as a family and secure a future for little Archie, born of the blood of them all. But not yet. The grief had to pass, the end of an era, and a new one about to begin.